Good afternoon, and I just want to welcome everybody. My name is Kathy Crow, and Harlan and I are really happy and honored to welcome the Fund for American Studies today, along with our special guest, Lord Daniel Hannan. It's a real pleasure to gather everyone here at Old Parkland, a place that we've worked hard to reflect a respect for history, democratic ideals, the enduring institutions and people that shape our country. I thought I might begin with a quick and slightly unsettling observation. Recent surveys tell us that many Americans cannot name the three branches of government. Some aren't sure of what the First Amendment actually protects. And a surprising number believe our founding documents could be suggestion over structure. It's easy to grimace at that until you stop and consider where that leads. Because a country that forgets how it governs itself begins, slowly but surely, to lose its capacity to govern itself well. If civic education continues to erode, we don't just risk a few wrong answers on a survey, we risk something far more consequential. A generation less equipped to weigh evidence, less grounded in first principles, and more vulnerable to noise, division, and shallow thinking. Our politics become more reactive than thoughtful, our institutions become more fragile than resilient, and our shared sense of national purpose begins to fray. But the good news, and the reason that we're here today, is that this trajectory is not inevitable. The Fund for American Studies is doing the deeply important work of restoring what should never have been lost, a serious, rigorous, and inspiring education in the ideas that underpin our democracy. Teaching students not just to memorize the facts, but to understand the why behind them. Not just learning history, but appreciating that history shapes our present and safeguards our future. When young people engage seriously with the Constitution, with free markets, and with the habits of civil discourse, they don't just become more informed, they become more thoughtful citizens, better leaders, and stronger stewards of the institutions we all rely on. And this is where the Fund for American Studies thrives, where leadership, entrepreneurship, and civic engagement run deep. They understand that investing in the next generation is not abstract, it's essential. So this afternoon, we gather not simply to support a program, but to listen and learn about how to be better stewards, strengthening the foundation of our republic, and to ensure that the principles we've inherited are not only preserved, but carried forward with clarity, confidence, and conviction. We're grateful to do that work together and grateful that each of you is here today. And now I want to welcome Roger Ream, President of the Fund for American Studies, to the podium. Thank you. Thank you, Roger. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. Thank you to Harlan and Kathy Crow for this beautiful, inspiring debate chamber that we're meeting in today. It's just such a great pleasure to be here at the Old Parkland for this event, and it's so appropriate as well. I want to thank all of you for joining us today and take just a few minutes to describe the work of the Fund for American Studies. Our mission is to develop courageous citizens who can protect our country's heritage of limited government and economic freedom. We consider this an obligation. Each generation must prepare the next for leadership to carry on our experiment in liberty, because that's what it is, an experiment. The outcome is forever uncertain. The United States is the oldest democratic republic on the planet Earth. That alone makes us exceptional. But we are not exceptional only because of our longevity, but because the ideas that inspired our founding and the ideas that are in our Declaration of Independence express our exceptionalism. These are ideas we must transmit to the rising generation. It is critically important that we do so. As Kathy Crow touched on, in recent decades, our founding stories and our founders themselves, those who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, have come under attack. We have failed to transmit the ideas found in the Declaration to rising generations. From Howard Zinn's textbook, People's History of the United States, to the New York Times 1619 Project, an alternative narrative that disparages our heritage has been infused in our schools and aimed directly at the rising generation. The result are polls that Kathy Crow cited, where young people in increasing numbers are not proud of our history, and many embrace socialism. It was Vladimir Lenin who said, "Give me just one generation of youth and I'll transform the whole world." And he did at the cost of tens of millions of lives. I was recently told a story of a young lady who used to work as a park ranger in Philadelphia. Every day she got to show people from around the world the birthplace of our country. One particular visitor held a special place in her heart, a certain 10-year-old boy who came to see the Liberty Bell. Because the bell is so fragile, and I'm sure many of you have seen it, there's a ranger that stands there to guard it because no one is allowed to touch it. One day, this ranger said she was guarding the bell, and a mother asked if her son could touch it. The ranger explained that in order to protect the bell, visitors were not allowed to do so. Then the mother explained that her little boy was blind. At that moment, this park ranger lifted the boy up so he could run his hands along the bell and experience it the only way he could. She let him feel the crack in the bell and guided his hand as he ran it along the inscription, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof." The little boy got to experience this priceless piece of history in a way few others ever do. But someone had to be there to lift him up and make that possible. That, I think, in a nutshell, is the work we do at the Fund for American Studies. We're lifting up young Americans, high school and college students and young professionals, so they can have an encounter with the ideas of liberty that would not otherwise be possible. And that is how the Fund for American Studies proclaims liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. Last year, as our summer programs were winding down, I hosted a focus group of sorts with several donors who came in to see some of the students whose scholarships they provided. Sitting around the table in our office at lunch, reflecting on the summer, the donor then asked the students, "I'd like each of you to tell me what was the highlight of the summer for you?" I expected to hear our students mention a guest speaker, maybe Daniel Hannan, who spoke last summer and gave an excellent speech, perhaps an internship experience or life living in Washington, D.C. Instead, two students gave almost identical answers that kind of stopped me in my tracks, and exactly what I would hope they would say in front of a donor. They told me, they each said the favorite part of their program was when they took 2 days of their government class to read the Declaration of Independence. They said they didn't just skim it, they read it line by line, word for word, and talked about it and analyzed it. And both students explained that they thought this was probably the first time they may have ever read the whole Declaration of Independence from beginning to end, certainly ever done it that thoroughly. One said he might have read it in middle school civics class. But for them to say that was the highlight of the summer was just, I thought, incredible. It's an experience that they said changed something for them and gave them a deeper appreciation of the American founding. I think one student I jotted down in my notes said, "I fell in love with those values all over again." So this is why we exist, and this is why our work's so important, especially in the year of our semi-quincentennial. We want to assure that young Americans will be leaders in the future, understand why we are an exceptional country and why these values are so precious and must be preserved. This kind of education doesn't happen by accident. We're in the final stages right now of selecting roughly 1,500 students. High school and college students will be with us in our summer programs. We have 30 programs for high school students, and we have summer-long programs for college students in Washington, D.C. Students are interested in careers in journalism, international affairs, public policy, economics, government, and they'll be coming to our programs in June for 2 months of courses and internships and lots of special guest lectures. This does make a difference. Our graduates serve as members of Congress. You read them almost every day in the Wall Street Journal. They are reporting the news, they're writing books, They're having influence in their communities and the life of the nation. I'll just mention one more program before I introduce our next speaker. It's our Journalism Fellowships program. Every year now we're selecting young people coming out of college who've been part of our journalism network on their campuses, and we're paying their salaries to work as fellows at major newspapers. We have 3 fellows now, Joseph Rago fellows, working at the Wall Street Journal on the opinion pages. They get to edit the people you read in the Wall Street Journal. They get to write bylined pieces. They get to attend the editorial board meetings. 4 actually of these fellows now, as of last week, have been hired full-time and continue to write for the Wall Street Journal. One left there, and she's on the editorial board of the Washington Post. And we're pleased to just recently announce now we're going to have fellowships as well for young people to work at the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the Economist, and the Dispatch. So we'll have at least 7 fellows every year working for 9 to 12 months in these publications. It's the equivalent, really, of clerking for a Supreme Court justice, because they get credentialed, they get experience that enables them to be successful in their careers. Well, now you're going to have the opportunity to hear some of the content we teach to our students during the summer and drill down a little more on the issue of civic education in our country. First, we'll hear from Ryan Streeter of the TFAS Institute at the University of Texas in Austin. Ryan is someone I've known since he was in Washington at AEI, and he's involved with some really outstanding things you'll hear about at the University of Texas. He'll be joined for a discussion with my colleague Lindsay Craig of TFAS. Following them, you'll hear from our academic director, Ann Bradley. She will be joined for a discussion with Kate Gangemi, who's at the University of Texas, getting her PhD and was a former Woodhouse Fellow at the Fund for American Studies. And then we'll close with Lord Daniel Hannan, who you'll just love. So we're so glad that Lord Hannan is serving this year as our TFAS America 250 Fellow and is traveling around the country giving talks to audiences of all ages about why America's founding principles are so important to the entire world. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Ryan Streeter.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you for that, Roger, and thank you for your leadership at TFAS over the years. It's just a tremendous program. As someone who's spent about 15 years of my career in Washington, D.C., what he says is true. You just run into TFAS alumni everywhere. When I was running the domestic policy program at the American Enterprise Institute with perhaps 25 to 30 research assistants at any given time, they were undoubtedly, oversampled as TFAS alums. And the contribution that you've made to the quality of public discourse and policymaking in the nation's capital and beyond is really kind of hard to measure. So I really appreciate having a chance to be with all of you here today. It's personal for me in the first time this year because my son Max is a Woodhouse Fellow this year. So we now have a family member part of the program for the first time ever, which is terrific. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today, and I'll look forward to some time together with you now and then also afterwards to continue the conversation on these really important topics that we're talking about today. And I'm really glad to be joined by a fellow Longhorn and Kate over here as well. We're well represented here today. And then, of course, my good friend Dan Hannan, who I've known since our days in London at the Legatum Institute, which I was one of the first co-founding directors of, along with UT's current provost, Will Inbode. And so all these things come back together. We all kind of end up back in Texas at some point. So I'm here. I've been at the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas for 2.5 years. We're a new a center of ideas and inquiry at the University of Texas. From the beginning, people have likened us to the Hoover Institution at Stanford, that we are to be the Texas Hoover. That's not just an aspiration. We expect to grow into something of a competitive size, and I already think quality. And it's a great time to be at the university in this role because we're at the center of a renewed commitment at the University of Texas at Austin to this classical idea of progress rooted in classical inquiry and education. And it may be too soon to say we're a national model for reform in higher education. I don't think it's too soon to say that we are the largest experiment in the country right now for what it means to create reforms at a large research university like the University of Texas. We take seriously the commitment to this classical idea of inquiry and education into the great ideas of the past, into the disputed and unresolved questions of the present and the future. And we take seriously the fact that our university, as all universities, stand on the shoulders of several centuries of achievements that many of us take for granted now, but were novel not that long ago in our history. It was a great achievement to actually even come up with the idea of progress, that we should be educating and doing research for the sake of improving our society, improving ourselves as individuals. And that idea of progress was born at a unique time in our history. I'll do a very brief history here, since this isn't a history lesson. When you go back to the 16th and 17th century in Britain and in some parts of Northern Europe, most notably like the Netherlands or the Dutch Republic, you start to see the use of this word improvement. It started out as an agricultural term, really. You would improve land. When land would be fallow, you would improve it to make it profitable. You'd plant things, you'd raise livestock. And you start to see in the written works of the time this migration of the word to talking about people themselves, that we could improve our manners, we could improve our knowledge and grasp of reality, we could actually improve our abilities as people. And this idea of improvement really gives birth to this idea of progress, not just as a society, but as individuals. This notion that we can actually apply ourselves to an ideal that's better than ourselves and actually become something that we never thought we could be before. It's hard to imagine that there was a time when the idea of improvement didn't really exist. There's not really analogs for it in the ancient world, in the medieval world. There were ideas of virtue and becoming a more virtuous person. In the more ancient Greek idea of becoming the best version of a human being you could be, or in the Christian notion of becoming more godlike through Christian virtue. But the idea that the son or daughter of generations of farmers could, through the improvement of their knowledge, improvement of their abilities, become a mathematician or an artisan or an engineer was a new and novel concept. And it was during this time that you start to see the concept of the pursuit of happiness enter the public discourse. It shows up in the Scottish Enlightenment in the early 18th century, and by the time you get to the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson writes that our unalienable rights, among these are included life, liberty, and not just the pursuit of property, but the pursuit of happiness. This idea that our best efforts should be to make ourselves better versions of ourselves. There are historians who have reconstructed the book trade sales in the big book markets of Amsterdam and Frankfurt kind of during this time. Turns out that 1 in 5 books owned in the Netherlands, and it was similar in Great Britain, were self-improvement books. How to become a better person, how to become richer, how to have better manners, how to be more sophisticated. This was something we've never seen historically before. And so our declaration is a precious document because it lays out these unalienable rights, the pursuit of happiness being one of them. And I would draw you back to its relationship to the concept of liberty itself, which the founders understood very well, which is that the concept of liberty is quite meaningless without an active notion of human agency, right? If you are not free to actually exercise agency over your life, can you say that you're really free? The idea that liberty is essentially meaningless without agency was familiar to and a part of the commitment of our founders. And so the idea that you could pursue your dreams or fulfill your aspirations or create new things or discover new realities, that's what freedom is for. You can restrict agency in basically one of two ways. It can happen at the personal level. If you don't cultivate your ability to make decisions and to pursue opportunity, you can't say that you're truly exercising agency. You can also do it at the societal level. You can make it too hard for people to exercise their agency. Perhaps housing's too expensive where the jobs are. Perhaps government makes it too easy for people to stay on welfare instead of getting out and making a life and a living for themselves. Maybe we erect too many barriers for people to be able to pursue the occupation that they want. The American experiment at its core is about amplifying the level of agency for as many people as possible so that fulfilling their aspirations, pursuing happiness, as the founders understood it, is possible for them. This is our great achievement. Since the time of the founding until now, a very key center of gravity for this notion of progress through exercising our agency in the pursuit of happiness are our universities. They've been central from the beginning, and especially in the last 150 years when it comes to the contribution they have made to new invention, to discovery, for the ability for forward motion to happen in a whole range of different fields. It's hard to quantify, but it's real. And then also at the individual level, a university education in its best form equips people to actually responsibly exercise their agency and their liberty in their pursuit of happiness. There's some research that's really interesting that shows the returns to all the stuff you didn't actually study in college pays off in terms of lifetime earnings more than a STEM degree, meaning just the university experience of learning how to think critically, to read, to write, to make presentations, to debate, and to argue is actually what helps you progress through your life. Your STEM degree might get you your first job or maybe your second job out of college, but 20, 30 years from now, it's these other things that you benefit from that people that didn't go to university don't experience. And so this is absolutely important that we get it right. And we know that from the latter half of the 20th century until now, our universities have kind of fallen down on this job. Not uniformly and not in the same way everywhere, but they have forsaken their fundamental original purpose to promote this kind of a vision of progress. Ironically, I think our universities, in the name of progressivism, have become some of the most anti-progress institutions in the country when it comes to treating questions as settled, shutting down debate, having ideological monocultures. It's a story that's so well known, I'm not going to repeat it here, but I think you all know the reality that I'm talking about. And what we're doing at the University of Texas is uniquely situated in this moment. At the Civitas Institute, we've doubled down on concepts related to economic dynamism. If you want more people in more places creating and building more things, what sorts of things do we need to change, both in our education systems and in our policies? We have a major body of work on constitutionalism, law, and policy. What's happening in the legal system right now? What does it mean for liberties for whole classes of individuals or sectors of our economy? Our scholars are doing a lot of work, and we'll be doing a lot more this year, just on the American dream and human aspiration and upward mobility in general, as we start a new lab and focus a lot more work on what are the underpinnings of the pursuit of happiness at the household level. And this year, we're also standing up a whole programmatic portfolio of work on just the future of higher education in general, in innovating in the future so that our universities can recover what they should have been. Pano Canales, the founding president of the University of Austin, UATX, has left there and is now a senior fellow at Civitas and will lead that effort. So we're right in the middle of trying to reestablish these core commitments that we've gathered here today to talk, but that's not all. What else are we doing at the University of Texas? Well, for what we're doing, we're a thought leadership mechanism for the university. So we publish a lot to get to the more practical level at the Civitas Institute. If you haven't seen our flagship magazine, Civitas Outlook, just go to civitasoutlook.com and subscribe. That readership's been growing at a rapid clip over the course of the year. And it serves as a platform for academics, for other professional writers, think tank leaders, and so on, to weigh in on issues of the day, on these issues of economic liberty, on constitutionalism, on the expansion of liberty at the cultural and social level. We've begun publishing books with the University of Texas Press. We'll have our anthology out on the 250th next month. It's available online right now. It's a beautifully designed website. All of our stuff's beautiful, by the way. When you go to our website, you'll be able to see at the civitasinstitute.org, you can see a link to our new anthology. And we put out our first book on economic dynamism last year, featuring leading writers like Deirdre McCloskey, Ed Glazer, Nobel laureate Edmund Phelps, and others. So we're trying to create an environment for our podcasts, our videos, our publications to reinforce all of these principles, to help educators, to help policymakers, and help the media understand what it means to actually renew a commitment to inquiry and research and idea generation in a way that's true to our classically liberal origins and ideas. This is proving an opportunity to recruit lots of scholars to the University of Texas. And at the Civitas Institute, we're hiring faculty right now. We're the first institute at the University of Texas to actually have faculty lines that we can bring people in. So we have economists, political scientists, constitutional theorists, and historians all coming in that will teach in different parts of the university. And they'll also be a part of another great reform going on at the University of Texas right now, which is our core curriculum reform. Next month, our committee that has come together to redo our core curriculum will deliver its final report with a goal of, in the fall of 2027, all 9,000 incoming freshmen at the University of Texas will go through a truly reformed classically liberal education. So what we used to call Western civilization, US constitutionalism, economics, and all of that. Great stuff will be whatever. It doesn't matter if you're an engineering major, nursing major, political science major, economics major. The core is getting reestablished at the University of Texas, and the people that we're hiring at Civitas and elsewhere around the university are also going to teach in the core. Another new and exciting development at the university is the School of Civic Leadership, which we've been in partnership with from the very beginning. Which has now, it's welcomed a second class of freshmen last fall. Its first class was in the fall of 2024. Just under 300 students that are declared majors in the civics honors degree there, which is, again, this classically core liberal arts education designed to reintroduce students to the great questions of civilization, institutional history, and equip them for lives of leadership. They'll have 40 faculty by this fall. They'll introduce 2 more degree programs, a grand strategy program a year from this fall, which was a foreign policy element to the civics honors degree, and a great books degree program. And it's also, like what we're doing at Civitas, what the School of Civic Leadership's doing, it's attracting a lot of people that have been kind of hungry to do their research in and teach in programs like this. This is a season of giving us an opportunity to bring in more ideological diversity to the university as well. And so outside of the School of Civic Leadership and Civitas, we're using this as an opportunity to bring more people into more departments across the university that can add to that ideological diversity that we need. And we published our Statement of Academic Freedom and Integrity last fall, which I think is a model for universities that want to recommit themselves to free inquiry on campus and free expression. It's a lot, and it's meant to be a lot. And the goal, as I said, is to be a model of reform at the highest level at the University of Texas at Austin that other universities can learn from and model. And you probably have been paying attention to the other civic schools that have been standing up at other state public universities, and those are all part of what I see as a great reform effort. What we're trying to show at the University of Texas is that you can go beyond those schools to use them as anchors for reform across campus. One thing I would say as a note on quality, too, I want to focus just on quality before I wrap up my remarks here, too, is we found that we bring in really high quality people as faculty candidates, speakers, and all of that. And I think, when you're starting a reform effort like this, there's an assumption in the monoculture on campuses that our people aren't as good as their people. And what we're showing by who we're hiring and by the people that we're bringing on campus to speak, that some of the best programming at the University of Texas, I think, has been happening in the last couple of years in terms of our events, in terms of the publications that we're putting out there, in terms of our podcasts, in terms of our video content. It's superb. If you don't believe me, just if you know Peter Robinson from the Hoover Institution, we have part of Peter's time now. He has Peter Robinson Unbridled. It's a very Austin, very Texas, very University of Texas show. And just look at who he's had on the show and look at the quality of that production, and I think you'll get a sense of what I mean. I want everyone to have hope for the future. If you had told me 5, 6, 7 years ago that some of the brightest spots of reform and idealism in America would be on our universities, I probably would have laughed at you. And now I'm in the middle of this, and I really do believe that we have this great opportunity right now to renew this country by renewing our institutions of higher education. It's not going to be possible everywhere. I think large state universities like what we're doing at the University of Texas are places that are ripe for reform in some of the right places. But I want to encourage those of you who are interested in the future of reform to to take heart at what you see happening at a place like UT and what's happening around the country in some of these other places to show what's possible. No one's really written this history. Someone who wants to have a future research project who's younger, this is a great history project to take on. But about 100 years ago, if you go back and you read what people like Irving Babbitt at Harvard and other literary essayists back in the day, in the 1920s, right after a horrible world war and a global pandemic, and the introduction of new German models of higher education, increasing secularization. It was actually happening back then too. Church attendance was declining. You start to see these pronouncements that sound a lot like what conservative writers over the last 10 years have been saying, talking about the decimation of culture, that the best days are behind us, that the totalizing collectivist industrial secularization of collectivist societies you're starting to see rising in Russia and across Europe. There was a lot of pessimism. And it really did seem like hope was lost for a lot of people. When Russell Kirk submitted his first draft of The Conservative Mind to his publisher, he called it the conservative rout, because he thought that he was cataloging the best ideas of a movement that he thought was dead. And then what happened? Then over the next 20 years or so, you had the launch of great books programs at Columbia and at the University of Chicago. You had the formation of the Mount Pelerin Society and a whole new approach to economics that brought together people from a variety of disciplines. You even had C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien starting writing fantasy with a very self-aware idea that they were pushing back against this totalizing secularism of the day. None of this was coordinated from a central office. It happened in multiple places, and we ended up with a second half of the 20th century that produced all kinds of positive developments that nobody in 1925 would have forecasted. I think we're on the cusp of something like that in higher education right now. I think these reforms are real. I think the appetites for them are real, and I think it's a really great time to be involved in them. So I'm happy to follow up with any questions afterwards for people that are interested in your home university, other things that you might be able to learn from what we're doing, including mistakes that we might be making. And I look forward to my conversation with Lindsay. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Ryan. That was an excellent start to our program. I want to take the opportunity to go back 250 years. So we like to say...
Love that century.
Yeah, it's good. As we were talking about at lunch. One of the things that I think this semi-quincentennial provides all of us is the opportunity to go back and really understand what it was that the founders were thinking of, what is the context in which they were existing, why the Declaration of Independence was this radical departure from everything that had come before it. And then that really interesting period, which I hope actually we can do a lot of things celebrating 250th leading up to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, right? Like we've got a lot of 250th things coming for all of you. But when we go back to that time and we look at what the founders were grappling with, and you touched on it a little bit, so that's why I wanted to follow up. And, you know, the role of the citizen was something that was very important to them to define in a new nation where you would not have a monarchy and that you wanted to have a decentralized system of government to, as we've talked about, you know, allow for the maximum amount of human flourishing. That was a concept that they knew of so early on. Because they had been, you know, doing a lot of it right here on their own, right?
Yeah.
As adolescents. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about how we think about teaching the founding, but also I think this very important part of sort of a keystone of the way that the founders wanted to inspire citizens, but also make sure that the government, as some of them wrote about, was actually there to create this structure within which they could have the maximum amount of flourishing.
Yeah, no, it's a great time to go back and reflect on, because the questions that they were wrestling with, for us, looking back, it kind of looked like the future must be certain. It didn't feel certain to them. There's actually a good book by, I think, Dennis Rasmussen on this. All the core founders, except Madison, died as pessimists. George Washington, John Adams, Alexander, they all died thinking this thing was going to fall apart.
Right.
Madison remained hopeful to the end. I guess he was a cheerful little
It's a republic if you can keep it.
Yeah, a republic if you can keep it. Because they believe very much in what you're saying, that the best government, a Republican, small r Republican government, does rely on the knowledge, virtue, and ability of the citizens there, not just the people that you elect to run the government, but you have to have people who are aware of the institutions that govern the country. They know how to change those institutions. They have kind of a shared idea of what improvement looks like going back to this. And they knew that by creating a system of checks and balances, you stood the best chance to prevent factions from becoming too powerful. And they did their best to give us a constitution that would preserve those things. And the Constitution really rests on some of those core ideas in the Declaration, and then some of the other things that aren't written down, but that really inform the way that they thought. It was a radical idea back then to think of economic activity as having a political benefit. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, also the 250th anniversary of that, he summarized in that big fat book a body of thought that he and David Hume and Francis Hutcheson and Adam Ferguson, there were a whole bunch of thinkers in that unique part, the northern part of Great Britain, Scotland, where my oldest child lives and I'm deeply love, that it's better when people have the ability to improve their lives through being artisans and through trade and through merchant activity than running around and stealing each other's chickens and hens and warring with each other. You know, that when people have a notion of improvement that's not political and they have economic activity that they can engage in, we want to strengthen those institutions as well, because that will create positive things for behavior, for virtue, in addition to the economic benefits that you get. And while we didn't have a theorist among the founders like Adam Smith, that was a shared set of beliefs among the founders as well. And so they understood that by having a limited government where people's energies throughout the day were mostly applied in commercial activity and the things that were related to not just providing for the basics for your family, but again for improving your future, it would have a great public benefit as well, and that we need to understand the way the economy works. We need to understand the way power is checked in our divided government, and then we need to educate citizens so that they can really participate in those things.
Yeah, I like that when Jefferson was writing about the importance of the definition of a citizen, you know, that we needed educated citizens, and I think so many people today misinterpret that as like when he was thinking of University of Virginia much later, right? Yeah. But at the time of the founding, he's actually thinking about it in reference to Socrates and Cicero, and thinking about, I have the education, I have the personal responsibility to take care of myself, right, and my family and my community, and then comes the government and the economy and all these other things around it. But my first responsibility is to myself, how I act as a citizen. And as they talk so much about being virtuous, as you mentioned in your remarks, do you think that then in this sort of slow undermining of the way that we taught about the American founding, and certainly the way civics then changed over time, which was sort of a very purposeful erosion of the American founding ideals, that we've really lost that narrative of the responsibility of what a citizen is? Yeah,
for sure. And you know, I mentioned briefly in my remarks that, you know, one of the limitations on people being able to exercise human agency to its fullest extent is the belief that you don't have that agency, you know, that you are the product of your environment. There are structural factors that prevent you from being the better version of yourself. And that becomes a narrative that can be reinforcing in a society in ways that is destructive. And we've seen that now across the ideological spectrum.
Right.
It's been a multi-decade effort on kind of the ideological left in the country to find ways of explaining what's happening in the world through purely structural forms, right? So we're all familiar with the idea of structural racism and the patriarchy and these sorts of things. But that narrative has really taken hold on the ideological right in some ways as well, where there's an idea that macroeconomic forces have prevented people from being able to improve their lives and the rest of it. And that becomes the basis of what we call grievance politics. And grievance politics is really the idea that human agency just doesn't matter that much. And you know, if this is a foreign concept to you, you haven't been spending enough time in universities like we are. I mean, it is like the default position of certain entire departments at universities and a manner of thinking. And so when you tell people that the American dream is dead or it's a fiction because outcomes are basically determined, you can actually change behavior. And if you create even a policy environment that makes it really hard for people to exercise their own agency, people's behavior will change over time. You can make a dynamic people less dynamic, either by preaching a gospel of grievance politics or by trying to protect people from all the bad things that can happen when they're exercising too much agency. Take the German economy, for instance, there. I love Germany. I've lived there twice. I drive a German car. I have German friends. Germans, they patent a lot of stuff, and they're great engineers, hence my car, but they haven't invented anything new in a long time. Nobody lives more than about 5 miles from where they were born. They didn't used to be that way, but they've created a society in which exercising agency doesn't matter. Grievance politics is not formalized in a regulatory structure that way, but we have done a really good job of promoting that primarily in our universities and through our media environment, so that we train a whole generation of young people to believe that whatever problem that they're facing is being imposed on them from a macro force, that they can only really oppose it is through some kind of collective action, so grabbing the reins of political power. And that's just anthropologically, historically, and empirically untrue. Being able to pursue your own happiness, to try to dream up aspirations and fulfill them, it's still very alive and well in America. Most people believe that or want to believe it, and we've had an elite class of people that have been trying to persuade us it's not true. The university has to be a place where progress is possible. It has to be a place where you believe in breakthrough inventions at the research level, and where you believe that you can actually equip students to become leaders tomorrow who can actually go on and do and build great things. And that has to start at the level of introducing them to great things, great ideas, great achievements, the great problems that we haven't overcome yet that require future leadership to change. And if you make that a part of your curriculum, you're going to produce those kinds of people. You're going to create an environment for those people to thrive. And why in the world we don't want to do that, I don't understand.
Well, I think that it's the sort of the immorality of the progressive left, where they actually do want to make sure that they're not, allowing people to rise up, but they're basically keeping that down, so that then there seems to be less of a, wideness in the strata. And we can call it out for what it is. It's immoral because you're basically holding people back from, being what they could do, what they could really be. And it's also just antithetical to the spirit of the founding. I mean, the founders spent a lot of time and put their lives on the line, right, so that we could be able to choose our own destiny.
Right, yeah. A lot of us, in this world of the academy and in the kinds of organizations that like TFAS is, a lot of us have become accustomed to quoting Alexis de Tocqueville, the famous French traveler who wrote Democracy in America from his travels in America in the 1830s. And Tocqueville's most famous for writing about what we talk about civil society or social life in America, right? That if you know anything about Tocqueville, you know that he went around and he's like, man, all these citizens in New England get together and do things that my government in France has to do. They need a new bridge, they raise money, they hire some people, they build a bridge. They have poor people in their community, they take care of the poor people. And it's like this notion of collective action that's not government mandated is a thing. And that's what Tocqueville is famous for. But when you read his whole book, he was also just fascinated by the fact that Americans just can't stop building things, like not just to solve problems. They're constantly trying to find ways to convert fallow land into something profitable. In one passage, he writes about them, before they even finish the roof on their house, they sell it. They're flipping houses.
Yeah.
And he was like, I think, and he actually saw all that good civil society stuff as a kind of a check on like unmitigated passion for gain. And what he puts his finger on is this amazing thing that we've achieved in this country, better than anywhere else I think on planet Earth, is to create the conditions for people to actually achieve way more than anyone would have expected them to achieve, but also to have their behavior conditioned so they don't get themselves into trouble, they don't become too ambitious and wreck their lives, by having these other supports around them, these institutions of civic life.
Civil society.
Yeah, your schools, your houses of worship, your local governments, these things that people can participate in that help them channel these energies in productive ways. And you have to create the institutions that people can participate in, and then you have to help them understand what kinds of virtues and behaviors they should be aiming for.
Those great mediating structures that help civil society stay together. Before we go to questions, and there'll be a microphone that comes around to you all, you mentioned Tocqueville, and I wanted to actually ask you about, he also wrote about reflective patriotism, which I think is something that is also sort of part of, or should be part of people's understanding of how we got here, is that there's a sort of this purposeful undermining of this too, right? And so you end up with a lot of not very patriotic young people if you teach them that the American founding was born in sin and is still in sin, and we're the product of all of that, and nothing is perfect, and it's important to understand. I was at a conference, and Ken Burns was saying it's important to study warts and all, but you can't study only the warts. And aside from the fact that I had to pick my jaw up off the floor, I was like, that is really important at this moment when we're studying the founding. And what most people have learned in school over the last 15 years, including my daughter, was taught from Howard Zinn and Ibram X. Kendi, and most people have heard of the 1619 Project just because that was the one that got the most publicity. But what's really lost in all of that is this sense of reflective patriotism, where you don't grow up with a love of country, so you're not thinking, I'm gonna fix the sidewalk myself, I'm gonna have the government do it myself, which is a weird thing to pull together, but that's actually where the practicality of it is. But it also means that you're not gonna probably pick up arms and defend your neighbor or defend the country. And so maybe you could just talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go to some questions.
Yeah, that's a great observation, and I think we've all probably experienced this in various ways ourselves. The effort is kind of like over many decades now to get people to just doubt the goodness in our institutions has paid off in bad ways for us, in ways that we can chronicle. And I think what's just most important is that you can't fix the bad in our institutions and in our society without understanding the good in those institutions. And to say that we need to burn the institutions down, which is, across the ideological spectrum, people are saying this now, ignores just the reality that most people experience in their daily lives, is that our institutions are actually working pretty well, and they would work better if we had more of what you're talking about. Recently there were some articles about how in some new research, we realized that our middle class has been hollowing out because too many people are escaping it for the upper middle class.
Yeah.
And there are people saying, that can't be true, that's wrong. People are stuck in place in this country. And you're like, well, actually, that's what's happening. Now, it might be that we have too many, the reason that's happening is we have dual earners in a home, both with highly educated, households, and that is actually part of what's happening. So you have a group of people that are stuck down here, but they're stuck down here because the nature of the economy has changed, and and we have to figure out a way for that part of the population to participate in the productive part of the economy. But to say that we have to tear down the productive part of the economy or put lids on it, it goes against what pretty much anyone who's experienced the benefit in our economy would actually want to do. And I think it's instructive that over the 60 years or so that Pew Charitable Trust has been polling people on their trust in institutions, that as trust in the federal government has declined, trust in state governments has declined, not as much as federal, but has been in the same trend line. Trust in your local government stayed pretty much the same for all that time. Yeah, and is that because our local governments don't have any graft or corruption? No, I mean, some of the most egregious examples are at the local level. It's because of that proximity factor, because people just kind of know this is a fixable problem. And when you are not educating people for an understanding of the core elements of what's good, what defines justice in our institutions and what doesn't, then you're not going to be able to repair those institutions that most people know. We want our courts to work. We want our legislatures to actually function and govern. And we want our public safety officials to actually have what they need to keep the streets safe. And we want our schools to teach our kids. And all of those are fixable problems because we've proven in different parts of this country that you can fix them. So understanding why you can fix them and how it worked should be a part of what we're actually teaching our students.
And that's why it's really good what you're doing at Civitas and the School of Civic Leadership.
Yeah, it's fun.
We have time for just a couple questions. Does anybody have questions? Oh, there's one over there. Run, Christine. No, I'm just kidding.
Hi. Given that our universities have, over the last 50 years or so, been, especially in economics and sociology and other departments, been predominantly Marxist and teaching ideologies that aren't free market, that aren't, traditional conservative civilization type studies, is there a shortage of talented PhDs? This was brought up to me yesterday, that there is a shortage of free market, for example, oriented PhDs, and do we need to import them? And if we did, from what countries would we do that?
Ryan, just answer briefly.
There are more of them out there than you might think. And that's been the encouraging thing about what we're doing. I think when you look at all the hiring that we're doing right now, the School of Civic Leadership, Civitas Institute, elsewhere at UT. You look at the Hamilton School at the University of Florida, they hired 55 people in 2 years. There are people out there getting their PhDs, keeping their head down. They may have never written an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal or been on a panel at the American Enterprise Institute or written for National Review, but they read those things, they consume them. They're interested, and a lot of them aren't thinking of themselves as movement conservatives or something. They would be classical liberals. They're committed to the core elements of small L liberalism, individual liberty, limited governments, market economies that work. They believe in these things, and they just are in departments where they're not allowed to say this stuff out loud. So when you put out a shingle and say, "Hey, we're hiring," they apply. And we're seeing a lot of that. I've been heartened. And also the number of postdocs as well, postdoctoral students that have reached out to us that we didn't even know existed, who've come and done their postdocs with us. We just brought one onto the faculty at the school last year, PhD in history at Yale. An economic historian from the LSE in London came to us. And they weren't a part of any training program, they just found us. I think there's more.
I think we have time for just one more quick question, if we have one. If not, okay. Oh, okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your speech. What do you mean by they're at departments where they're not allowed to say these things out loud? Since the university, in my experience, was a place of free thought and discussion.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's become not the case in a lot of universities, where certain questions are just considered settled. You see this just a lot in the humanities, as we know. It's not as much of a problem, say, in the sciences or in engineering. But that's been the problem that we've seen, especially on our elite university campuses, where people feel like they just can't actually express their views. There have been quite a few interesting surveys of faculty and students saying they self-censor a lot. They can't say things out loud. And even at the more mundane level, I mean, I taught at the School of Public Policy at UT like 10 years ago. It's gotten better since then when I was there. There are certain questions that are just considered settled. Certain questions relating to, if you want to be a scholar of education and you're doing research where you think that charter schools and school vouchers are actually improving the quality of education, you're just not welcome to say that stuff. And that's one example. And we're hiring people to teach in our core who can teach the Constitution, because we don't have enough people that can teach the Constitution in our history department, frankly. So we have to import them from other places. So unfortunately, universities have become just too ideologically monochrome and have ruled out certain questions, and that's what we're trying to change. And you do that by bringing in really high quality people that have different points of view on these fundamental questions. And what we find is that a lot of the faculty at a place like UT, they actually want that. I think they know that they operate in kind of a monoculture, and it's a lot more fun to have real debates about the big issues. A university is where that should happen.
Well, we're looking at TFAS to be able to support you in all
Love
of
it.
your endeavors and see how we can partner both with University of Texas at Austin, as well as some of the other schools, like you mentioned, the Hamilton School, and Clemson has a school, and University of North Carolina, and Arizona. So there's a lot popping up, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for those of us who want to be looking to the next generation and inspire them to learn how to be a courageous citizen.
Yeah,
So,
great.
All right, thank you, Ryan.
Thanks very much.
And now we hear from Ann Bradley. You can go this way.
Well, good afternoon. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. I'm Ann Bradley, and I'm the George and Sally Mayer Fellow for Economic Education at the Fund for American Studies and the Academic Director. So thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Lindsay, for organizing this and for inviting me to be with you today. I just want to start, as an economist might, with a fact that many perhaps do not know. In 1774, on the eve of the American Revolution, colonial Americans were the most prosperous people on earth. The average colonist earned about 13 to 16 pounds a year. That sounds like almost nothing, and it is in modern terms. But history tells us that the American colonies led Great Britain in per capita purchasing power from 1700 and possibly as early as 1650. And this represented the highest incomes in the world at the time. They were ahead of Britain by 38% in 1700 and by 52% in 1774. The free white population of colonial America had the highest standard of living in the world. From just 1700 to 1774, the total output of the 13 colonies increased 12-fold. And this wasn't because of a king or a central plan or a government program. The founders didn't just inherit this prosperity. They understood why it existed, and they built a republic designed to protect it by codifying the virtues of personal responsibility and private enterprise to foster human flourishing and material prosperity. But the story doesn't actually begin with the founders. It begins on a cold shore in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. The Pilgrims arrived with a charter that required communal farming. Everything produced went into a common storehouse and was distributed equally regardless of effort. It sounded just and fair, perhaps. It was in practice a catastrophe. As Governor William Bradford recorded in his own hand, the system, quote, was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment. Young men resented working for other men's families without compensation. Women claimed illness to avoid the fields. Productivity collapsed. Within 2 years, nearly half the colony had died. This was not a failure of character per se. It was a failure of institutions. It was the predictable result of severing effort from reward, of ignoring the truths of human nature. And Bradford, to his great credit, recognized it. He saw that it doesn't work because it requires the planners to behave, in his words, as if they were wiser than God. He responded in 1623 by dividing the land into private plots. Each family farmed for themselves, and Bradford records what happened next with almost childlike wonder. It made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. The women, he writes, now went willingly into the fields and even brought their little ones with them. In 4 years, they had gone from starvation to surplus. The same people, the same land, an entirely different set of rules. The first Thanksgiving wasn't a celebration of collectivism. It was a feast made possible by abandoning it. Private property, a recognition that people respond to incentives, and the freedom to keep the fruits of your labor are a recognition of both human anthropology and economic truth, and are the difference between poverty and flourishing. The founders understood this deeply. They were not merely political philosophers. They were students of human nature. And they were building something the world had never seen, a commercial republic. They knew that a nation of free, self-interested people trading with one another across state lines would generate prosperity far beyond anything directed or controlled could produce. The Constitution they designed was, among other things, the largest free trade zone in the world at the time, prohibiting tariffs between states, establishing a common currency, and creating the legal infrastructure for commerce to flourish. The Commerce Clause codified these principles into our founding documents, recognizing that power is always a corrupting force, and that the accumulation of power would erode a commercial republic and its egalitarian material opportunities, replacing them with tyrannical political privilege that not only creates winners and losers, but also institutionalizes them through law and regulations. The founders knew that to keep the republic, we must codify and protect free enterprise, a prevailing social virtue. And embedded in all of this was a transcendent vision of what freedom was for. George Washington repeatedly referenced this verse in Scripture, Micah 4:4. They shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. He wrote about this in his letters and speeches. This was not decorative for Washington. He used that image of the vine and fig tree not merely as a picture of personal retirement, but as shorthand for an entire political philosophy: property rights, the rule of law, limited government, and the freedom to pursue one's own calling without fear of coercion or confiscation. He wrote it as a blessing and as a promise. The founders were not building a welfare state. They were building the conditions in which ordinary people could pursue extraordinary lives of their choosing. That vision was rooted in the economic way of thinking, a phrase that we use at TFAS all the time in our classrooms. People make choices under conditions of scarcity and radical uncertainty in pursuit of their own interests. Moreover, people are the only source of human capital, and that human capital is infinite. Human beings have dignity, but are limited in their knowledge and skills. With the right institutions, including secure property rights, voluntary exchange, the rule of law, limited government, sound money, and free trade, there would be no limit to the material well-being and human flourishing. The founders' framework worked, and the world noticed. Ryan already mentioned this. When Alexis de Tocqueville, a young French aristocrat, visited America in 1831, just 55 years after the signing of the Declaration, he was astonished by what he found. And it wasn't astonishment at the government. It was astonishment at what people were doing. He wrote that Americans of all ages and conditions and all dispositions constantly form associations: religious, commercial, moral, and educational associations. Wherever in France, for Tocqueville, you would find the government doing something, in America, he commented, you would find a voluntary association doing it instead. Tocqueville observed that the strong role of personal faith and religious freedom played in American life was strengthened, not weakened, by its separation from government. He warned of what he called soft despotism, a government that, in trying to do everything for people, slowly crowds out their freedom, their initiative, and their dignity by making them wards of the state. The founders feared this. The Pilgrims learned it the hard way. Bradford's great gift was recognizing that the problem wasn't the people, it was the system. Change the incentives, and the same people who were languishing became industrious and, as a result, prosperous. Fast forward to today and ask whether those institutions held. Let's talk about the data. The United States has a GDP of approximately 31 trillion, representing about 26% of all global output in the world. In a single lifetime, we have added $31 trillion in economic value. Economists often call this the hockey stick of economic growth. But GDP is really a proxy for material well-being. It represents our ability to afford to pay the rent, to buy a home, to send our kids to college, to put food on the table. To see this abundance in physical form, we turn to my favorite topic, which my colleagues know what I'm going to say now, the American grocery store. I think when on my tombstone it will say, "She loved Kroger," or something like this. There was no such thing as a grocery store in 1776, not as we know them today. This is not a natural phenomenon, it's an institutional one. And there's 30,000 items in the average American grocery store. Those items are only there because of these rules of the game we're talking about today. Again, property rights, the signals that prices provide, and the freedom to compete. When you break those rules, the shelves go empty. It happened in Plymouth, and it's happening around the world today. A particular example is in Venezuela, where citizens are forced to barter out of their car trunks because political leaders chose to concentrate power and defy these principles. As we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, we simultaneously mark the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, the full title, An Inquiry into the Nature and the Causes of the Wealth of Nations. We must remember Smith's core insight that wealth accumulation is a social process powered by the division of labor and free trade. By lowering barriers and allowing goods, capital, and ideas to flow, societies expand, opportunities grow, costs of daily life are lowered, and overall wealth is increased. And trade is not just about stuff, it's about the exchange of ideas and sharing principles. We serve the common good better through free enterprise than through technocratic planning. This is Smith's point about the butcher and the baker and the brewer. We serve our neighbors best not by managing their choices, but by protecting their freedom to make them. In a free market, we only reward individuals with profit when they successfully serve those neighbors. Smith's political economy was grounded in a realistic understanding of human nature as well. As the father of modern economics, he knew that human flourishing didn't depend on us finding good men and put them in charge of the state or the government or other institutions. Instead, he said, we have to take people as they are and find ways to direct their self-interest toward the common good. James Madison echoed this truth in Federalist 51, reminding us that because men are not angels, government must be constrained. But the brilliance of the American system is that it doesn't just constrain the state. It uses the market to constrain the individual. While the Constitution constrains the government, the market constrains the producer through the relentless discipline of profit and loss. The founders read Adam Smith. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, whose 283rd birthday is today, so happy birthday, Thomas Jefferson, carried the Wealth of Nations around with him. And he recommended it often as reading material so that people could understand the principles that must buttress these economic and political institutions. And I think this brings us to the most important point. This prosperity did not happen accidentally. The founders did not just hope for it. They forged a framework that made American innovation possible and really defy their expectations by institutionalizing these principles of economic freedom. They understood that trade is not a zero-sum game and that property rights are the foundation of human dignity and productivity. As Smith showed us, wealth is not to be divided, but multiplied. G.K. Chesterton once remarked, "We are perishing from want of wonder, not want of wonders," which is why I love grocery stores. The abundance of our markets and the hockey stick of our growth are wonders indeed, but we cannot and should not take them for granted. And they coincide with limited government, checks on political power, and political liberty. Bradford was right in 1623, and that truth remains. We are the stewards of the most successful experiment in human self-governance in history. And as we celebrate America in its 250th year, let us be worthy of it and create courageous leaders and citizens so that we can pass it intact and thriving to the next generation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Anne, for those remarks, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you and sitting down for this conversation. So as Roger mentioned, I was very grateful to participate in the Woodhouse Public Policy Fellowship last year, and it's a delight to be here with you all today. So I want to start with civic education because it's on the mind following Ryan's remarks, and then hopefully pick up on some of the themes that you went into in your remarks. So as someone who's very much humanities oriented, and that's what I get to think about all day, I think that there's a tendency to think about civic education primarily through the lens of the great books. It's a great books enterprise, and so perhaps the connection to economics is not as immediately evident to some of us who are in the great books world. And you touched on this a little bit in your talk, but I'm hoping you can say a bit more about why economics in particular can teach us something about human nature, and why, because of that, it kind of belongs very naturally in this civic education enterprise.
I think that's a great start to the questions, because it isn't intuitive necessarily or obvious that, in studying civic education, we need to think like economists. And so maybe it's worth spending a little time talking about what that means. And I think the way I would start is to say that the value of the analytical tools that kind of the economic way of thinking gives us is that it helps us understand that we can't just wish for things because we have these intentions, right? We can't just wish for limited government that stays limited and for leaders that are people of high moral character. Those are all important things, but we need to think about the rules that govern people in those political, economic, and other institutions. And so I think what economics does is that it starts with those truths about human nature and says, you can't really have a good conversation, not even just about policy, which is way downstream from your system of government, but what type of government is going to work and promote liberty and remain limited without understanding who people are, because that's our job as economists. Human beings are the subject matter. And so we want to understand the choices that people make, and I think we have to understand what their proclivities are. And when you're thinking about constructing political institutions or what political institutions are appropriate, I think you have to start with, okay, I'm dealing with human beings always and everywhere. And I think, again, this was, kind of what made Smith, who was a moral philosopher, a profound economist. He said, we have to start with human nature. And we have to say, these are the things that are always true, no matter what time in history you were born, no matter your country of origin, no matter your gender, none of that matters. These are always true. And so then we have to kind of construct institutions around that. So I think if we don't get that first part right, then we're going to get a lot after that. We're going to make a lot of mistakes. And of course, the cost of those political institutional mistakes can be very high, can be devastating.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been talking a lot about the 250th anniversary of America, but 250 years of the Wealth of Nations coming up as well. And I think you raise a very important point that while Smith is often remembered for markets, he is also a moral philosopher. So can you say a little bit more about kind of how that broader moral vision can help us guard against the mistakes of modern policy? You were kind of getting to that towards the end. If you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, again, I think this goes back to Smith's understanding of the human person, which is that and I think this is a really important point, which is that human beings are flawed, we're finite, we make a lot of different types of mistakes. As Smith talked a lot about, we pursue our own self-interest. And you have to think about the time that he's writing is remarkable, which is kind of what I started with, which is, kind of people are just starting to move out of kind of agrarian living and but still predominant, but people are starting to move into the cities. And you can imagine we have all these people that live amongst each other and they don't know each other and they have different ideas about the good and what's true and religion and philosophy. And so he says this could go really, really wrong. We could just engage in a lot of plunder and violence. And of course, if you look at the whole story of human history, it's been a story of plunder and violence and theft and expropriation. So I think that's the moral element, which is, again, and for economists, we don't just look at intentions, we look at intentions as they're reconciled with results. It's not enough to say, well, kind of we wanted to create this good government, here's the institutions, and then that gets us off the hook. And so I think the moral element is that we have to take people as they are. We have to take the good and the bad. And then, kind of again, the American project, I think, and the Smithian project understand the fallibility, but also the profound importance of human creativity. And so when you get the right mix of institutions, you unleash individual human creativity on the world, and look what happens. Remarkable. The remarkable progress is also, it's moral in the sense that we are serving other people. I'm always stunned by that. When you go to, the grocery store, when you go to the grocery store, millions of people around the world brought you just the oranges, and there's like 10 types of oranges. And I live in Washington, D.C., there's oranges in December. And where did they come from? I don't have to know, but this kind of process allows me as kind of an ignorant beneficiary and just a customer to benefit from it, and then I'm allowed to kind of relieve myself. I don't have to figure out how to grow oranges if I want to eat one. That's one less thing. Great news. That's the moral element, is strangers are serving one another. And so I think that has to be aligned with the appropriate set of political and legal and cultural institutions, right? So none of this exists kind of in an isolated fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. So picking up on the human nature thread, it seems clear that the founders understood this. You mentioned Federalist 51. They kind of share this broadly Smithian understanding of human beings as fallen. We're not perfect, and so we need the proper incentives to act morally. So what do you think that the founding generation understood about economic liberty that perhaps we forget today?
I think part of it is that if you leave people to their own devices with the right set of institutions, again, their idea was that it was a commercial republic that was going to result not just in individual wealth accumulation, but in shared social wealth accumulation. So I think this idea is so important, and we are, at least when you listen to the rhetoric that's out there, I think we forget it or we lose it or something. But the world doesn't have to be a set of zero-sum games. But again, most of human history, it was. The way you got ahead was to take other people's stuff and to harm them. With, again, the right economic and political institutions, we've not only just reversed that, but we're living longer than ever. There's kind of a lot of opportunities for peace and prosperity, and we see a lot of that prosperity in our daily lives. So I think the founders understood that you could take human nature, and again, the rules matter for the outcomes that you're going to get. But I think we need to really disabuse ourselves of this idea that that wealth is a fixed pie. And I think that type of thinking goes hand in hand with the zero-sum game type of thinking. So if you believe that wealth is fixed, then you're going to be very worried about wealth distribution. If you see, though, that the economy is not really a pie in a market economy with limited government, that it's actually something that grows and grows and grows and we all get to benefit from it, I think that really transforms your thinking about what the appropriate role of government is. But if you don't believe that, you don't understand it, you don't see kind of, we have hindsight that they didn't have. So we see that it has taken effect. And I actually think it's the deviations of those understandings, of those principles that the founders held so dear, that lead us into trouble. Of a variety of different types of policy problems that we have, government spending problems, all these types of things are explicit deviations from the principles. So I think that they saw that, they weren't using the language economic freedom, which we are today, and they certainly weren't measuring it the way we are today, but I think they had the broad strokes and the concepts, and they wanted to institutionalize it as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about some of these modern threats, the anxiety about income inequality, one kind of modern example that comes to mind is the election of Zoran Mamdani in New York. Many people of my generation, I have a lot of friends who live in New York. They all went to the polls very enthusiastically. Yeah. I have some conservative friends in New York, but many of them were enthusiastically voting for Zoran Mamdani. And as I said, I think that this comes from what you're talking about, a kind of misunderstanding of wealth as a fixed pie. So going back to our theme today, developing courageous citizens and thinking about civic education, how do we teach people, how do you talk to young people about fixing some of these errors and thinking about wealth?
Yeah, I have so much to say about what's going on in New York City right now. So, there's a lot going on. And but to try to directly answer your question, I think what we have to do is be winsome and meet students where they are. I think that it is reasonable to think, imagine you're 25 years old, you have $200,000 in student debt, you take a great job in New York City, and you have to live in a 700 square foot apartment with 4 people. And this guy's like, I'll give you free buses and maybe a free grocery store in each borough. Okay, I'll take it. Right? So I think it sounds good. I think it sounds appealing. I think it sounds like, there's just like these billionaires out there and we're just gonna take a little bit more from them and, I get a free bus ride and I'm young and I can't afford stuff, so okay. So I think that sounds good on paper. So when I have students in the classroom, I don't think what you do in the first day is start to beat them over the head with, that's wrong. I think what we say is, I really start on the first day with human anthropology. I'm like, we gotta understand human beings, and then we have to understand the laws of economics because they are not up for negotiation. What is that? We live in a world of scarcity, incentives matter, all these types of things that people are self-interested, right? So we start there. And I think when you do that, that sounds very common sense to them. It's not like people are like, no, I disagree with scarcity. But if you can really drive that idea home, then what Mamdani is proposing runs into immediate problems, which is if we made, we can't make everything free. We can't round up, even if we were to round up all the billionaires, I think somebody did a data point on this, it would like fund the government for 10 months. This is not gonna get you anywhere. Not only that, but there's massive unintended consequences to that, which is people will leave. So, and that's what's happening in New York, right? So I actually think what you need to do is meet the students where they are because they have been bombarded by messaging on this. And we have polls with kind of young generations favoring socialism, and a new poll asking about communism. That just because they say they favor it doesn't mean they'd vote for it, but maybe they will, and in some cases they are. So I think it takes not one conversation, I think it takes a long time. But I think, again, we have to agree that we both want to make the world a better place. I think we have to agree that we all want human flourishing. And so when we treat the classroom like that, and then we open it up for discussion, and we don't, no, that's wrong, but like, let's think about the alternatives, which is what economists are supposed to do. At what cost and what are the alternatives of doing what we're gonna do? So I think that's where we have a real opportunity to present some alternatives. And then one other thing I'll say on this is I'm very explicit because I teach a public policy class. And so it would be very easy for them to view all of this as ideology. And so I say right away, look, your political opinions are none of my business and yours to keep. But I'm gonna judge you on how well you understand economics after we go through all of this together. And so when you start to learn and adopt the economic way of thinking, if you change your mind, great. If you don't change your mind, that's okay too. But it gives you an analytical tool to evaluate these things based on their efficacy, not just based on this sounds like a good idea to me. I think that's really important, but it takes a while to walk through that with them.
Yeah. Well, I wish we had more time to remedy all of the problems latent in socialism descending upon New York, but we're just about out of time. So let's go to questions, if there are any. Yeah.
Hi, I enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you.
I just want clarification on this issue of self-interest. Do you believe that the founders supported the idea of a virtuous self-interest? And the reason I ask that is because is that not what a proper civic education gives you
right.
in some way, an ability to cultivate and make decisions that are in your self-interest, but a self-interest that doesn't hurt you and possibly others?
Right, I think that's, yes, I think is a short answer. And I think that what's important about that is that what the founders understood, what Smith and others understood is that self-interest is the mechanism by which we make decisions, right? And I think for Smith, what's really important is that self-interest does not exclude benevolence or sacrifice. what he's arguing is that there's nobody that acts out of benevolence all the time, right? So again, the kind of, if you want to call it the prosperity project, is not about, and then Madison, I think, uses this language really well. It's not about finding angels and putting them in charge of the church and political institutions and hedge funds and like all these things, right? We're going to find the good people, we're going to put them in charge, and then it's going to be great. I think what he says is everybody can act, or always acts out of their self-interest, and that doesn't mean that we're always greedy. But it does mean that we have that propensity, and sometimes we're going to act that way, right? So it's really about devising a set of institutions. It's not going to eliminate greed. We can't do that, right? So I also think it's a mistake to argue that kind of a market economy is perfect, or that, as Lindsay said before, the American experiment is perfect. It's not, but again, for economists, the perfect is not what we're going for, because we know there's no heaven on earth, as Thomas Sowell would say. So we're looking at the relevant alternatives. So I think what you have to do is not say self-interest is bad, it just is. How do we get virtuous self-interest? Well, we need people of character, but we also need rules of the game that induce or encourage self-interest, kind of rightly understood, right? Which includes others as we make our choices. That's not just reckless plunder. So yes, I think is the answer. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, right here.
Hi, I really enjoyed y'all's conversation, and I think a little tidbit I kind of took out of it was this kind of notion of like progress as like a long-term continuous framework. So I guess my question to you, and something that I want to like posit, is with like the youth and trying to emphasize the importance of civic education and getting them excited. How do you plan to, I guess, roll that out? Should you, have these youth outreach programs and whatnot?
So are you asking how do we do it in the classroom in our various programs?
Because kids don't exactly have the best attention spans.
Well, yeah, and I think this is what kind of Lindsay and Ryan were talking about earlier, which is this just, if you believe that the American experiment has failed, it's based on false principles and it should be discarded, then if you're not going to actively teach people about it, and your kind of version of what teaching American history is also going to be very distorted. So part of it is just, I kind of thinking about bringing philosophy, politics, and economics together in the classroom, because we're not ever talking about any one of these things in a vacuum. We are talking about the interconnectedness of those institutions. And I think when, kind of students start to see this, I think they get excited about, very few people get really excited about economics. I mean, I'm one, Bob is one, but, like lots of us, not lots of people don't. So I think you have to show students how it's relevant. But I want to say one last thing to your question, which I think is so important. What economics teaches me is that there's no such thing as economic destiny. And I'm getting to kind of the first part of your question about thinking about progress. I think it's very easy, or would be very easy, for Americans to get lazy. And I think maybe we're there, right? We're intellectually lazy, our policies are lazy, because they just presume we've always been the wealthiest nation in the world and very successful, and the American dream is alive and well, and those things are true. But that doesn't mean they'll always be true. If we violate the rules of economics and the truth of human nature, then we will, over time, craft policy that will erode prosperity. And again, it's what I said in the talk, we don't want to create wards of the state. So I think we have to be vigilant around these ideas, and the only way to do that is to open up the conversation. But I think why I say it's important to understand there's no such thing as economic destiny. You see rags to riches stories, and that's every country. Prior to 1750, no country has experienced kind of a constant, kind of episodes of economic growth. So you had it here and there, but it wasn't sustained, right? But then you look at the riches to rags stories. Venezuela, right, is a story of this is what happens when you violate reality. It is inevitable and it will happen every time. And so I think that's how you encourage people to take this really seriously. And I think we see that in our students, which is exciting because then they want to talk more and learn more. So it's great. Thank you. Great question.
All right, well, that is all the time we have. We're going to have a short break, so feel free to go out into the foyer, and then we'll reconvene for Lord Hannon's keynote. But please join me in thanking Anne.
Thank you, Kate.
My name is John Demos, and I'm in the Development Office with the Fund for American Studies. So let me add my welcome to you tonight. I'd like to just briefly introduce one of our TFAS alumni who is going to share a few words. Caroline Pierce is a senior at Southern Methodist University, pursuing a BA in journalism with minors in political science and French. At SMU, she serves as a full voting member of the Board of Trustees for the 25-26 term, representing the student body as the student trustee. She's also the president of SMU's Phi Alpha Delta pre-law fraternity, a student worker in the Office of the Senior Vice President for Student Affairs, a member of Chi Omega sorority, and former associate editor of SMU Look magazine, a very busy young lady. In the summer of 2024, Caroline participated in the Fund for American Studies Journalism and Communications track summer program in Washington, D.C., interning as a freelance reporter on Capitol Hill for a national wire service. In this role, she interviewed members of Congress and covered press briefings and hearings on high-profile policy issues. She was able to meet some very fascinating people, which she'll tell us about. But as part of the TFAS program, she took the American Political Thought class, where she earned the Academic Excellence in Political Thought Award. She returned to TFAS in DC last summer to work as one of our program advisors. And she's been named a Fulbright semifinalist for the English Teaching Assistant Award in Belgium, and plans to attend law school in fall of 2027. So please welcome Caroline Pierce.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caroline Pierce. As John said, I'm a student at Southern Methodist University studying journalism with minors in political science and French. I participated in the TFAS Journalism and Communications track in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2024. I loved the experience so much that I returned the following summer as the Media and Operations Assistant, as well as a program advisor. TFAS truly changed my life. It gave me opportunities, skills, and friendships that I simply could not have found anywhere else. And I would not be where I am today without it. If you had told me that as a sophomore in college, I would spend my summer working as a journalist on Capitol Hill, I would not have believed you. But thanks to TFAS, that dream became a reality. I interned with the Laszlo Congressional Bureau, a national wire service. On my very first day, I was assigned to get a quote from Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And thanks to the support of my boss, I did. From there, I had opportunities to interview other lawmakers, such as Ted Cruz, Nancy Mace, and Marjorie Taylor Greene. One of my most unforgettable moments of my summer internship was during the NATO summit, where I attended a photo opportunity with Volodymyr Zelensky and Keir Starmer. I also covered a press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu and later sat inside the House chamber as he addressed Congress. These were moments I only had ever watched on the news, but thanks to TFAS, I was there doing the reporting myself. But TFAS is also so much more than internships. When I wasn't working or in my thought-provoking courses at George Mason University, I was attending TFAS events that broadened my perspective in ways I never expected. One of my favorite memories was visiting an embassy for the first time, where I had the opportunity to hear from former Swiss ambassador Jacques Pitlaud, once again disbelieving that this was my reality. Because of TFAS, I gained not only incredible experience, but also the confidence to pursue opportunities I once thought were out of reach. Back at SMU, I was selected to serve as student trustee, a full voting member of the SMU Board of Trustees, representing the student body. During that selection process, I spoke extensively about my TFAS experience and how it prepared me to engage with decision makers. Without TFAS, I don't think I would have that role today, so thank you. Returning as a program advisor this past summer led to, without a doubt, the best summer of my entire life. I had the opportunity to give back, support other students as they navigated their own transformative experiences, create meaningful, long-lasting friendships, and see firsthand the dedication of the incredible TFAS staff who make all of this possible. I want to take a moment to sincerely thank the entire TFAS team for welcoming me and supporting me. Your leadership and dedication are what make experiences like mine possible. And to the donors and supporters in this room, thank you. Your generosity is what makes TFAS accessible for students like me and so many others. Your generosity is not just funding a program. It's opening doors, shaping futures, and changing lives, just like it changed mine. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Caroline, and thank you all for being here. I'm Dan Branch. I get to introduce our keynote speaker and also serve as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Fund for American Studies, and was a student back in the dark ages. Long time ago, as a college student, I was introduced to Washington by the Fund for American Studies, and it was a transformative summer for me in so many ways, and so I've stayed on board and supported the efforts of Roger and the team for many, many years, and glad to do it. Also with us is a couple other trustees. Frank Lauinger is right here, and I think Derek McLean right here. So. And so we get to our speaker, if I can find my my comments here. Sorry, I'm just came in from the West Coast, and that Mixmaster traffic right downtown. I was doing really well until I hit that. But I was also thinking it's the 14th of April, and of course everyone knows that this is a momentous date, the tragic shooting of President Lincoln in 1865, but also in the years that we're focusing on. In 1775, it was just days before the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and then it was just months before the Declaration. In fact, the Congress was in session at this time in 1776. So it's Lord Hannon, you're here on a propitious time, and we're glad to have you in Dallas. Let me just say a little bit about Daniel Hannon. The Right Honorable the Lord Daniel Hannon of Kingsclear is a British writer, historian, and a member of the House of Lords. He's a longtime advocate for a free trade and a supporter of the Transatlantic Alliance. He previously served for over 2 decades, from 1999 to 2020, as a member of the European Parliament representing the United Kingdom in Brussels. And interesting, then played a prominent role in the Brexit debate. So what does that tell you? See, 20 years in Brussels, and then you vote to leave the European Union. The author of several books on shared political traditions of the English-speaking world, including The New Road to Serfdom, a letter of warning to America, so I recommend that to you, and among his other books, Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. Lord Hannon brings a distinctive perspective on the historical ties between the United Kingdom and the United States, making him an especially fitting choice for the TFAS America 250 Visiting Fellow, and a powerful voice as America approaches its 250th anniversary. So, Lord Hannon, welcome to Dallas. And Old Parkland. Good to see you, yeah.
Dan, thank you very much. And what a delight to be back in Dallas and to be in this room. When Roger said, would you help TFAS celebrate the semi-quincentennial, if that's the word I want to say. Of course, nothing I'd rather do. The best way to celebrate this propitious anniversary is by teaching people what it means. It's not bunting and fireworks, it's telling people the sublime story of what it means to be an American citizen and to be the inheritor of that glorious patrimony. I have only one condition, which is I want to speak on this stage in Old Parkland. I'd seen it on YouTube videos, and TFAS worked its magic, and here I am. And I just want to just take a moment and look around and ponder on the glory of the fact that something like this can be built today in our age of such ugly and brutal architecture. Take a moment to thank Harlan and Kathy Crow for what they've done. They are not here. They told me they're at the University of Texas in Austin. They said because they are seeing Judge Thomas. But I have my suspicions about this because I noticed there was a headline today in the Daily Texan, "Fate of Cesar Chavez statue unknown after allegations." This is in the University of Texas in Austin. So I suspect that they may be on a secret kind of ninja mission, and that before long, the Garden of Evil in Harlan's house will have a new addition, namely the statue of Cesar Chavez. I did think that actually Keir Starmer would be a useful addition, but I don't think that any sculptor could do justice to quite how lifeless he is in real life. He will outstatue any statue. So it's wonderful, wonderful to be here, and actually wonderful to be in Texas. I really wanted to come to this state, which, by the way, puts me in good company. Everyone's coming here. You don't hear a lot of local accents these days in Texas. In fact, I was talking to the Crows just before I started. They were talking about immigration and the challenges of immigration. And I thought, well, we've both actually kind of got the same problem, which is people fleeing hellholes and coming to better places. We have them coming from Asia and Africa. You have them coming from California. But you have managed that challenge extremely well, right? You assimilate them and you make them all great conservative Texans. And I think we can learn a great deal from your approach. But I wanted to get completely inundated, saturated in Texan culture. Last night, I went out and I thought I'd better, get properly Texan. And I ordered a great dinner of something called calf fries. And I'm not 100% clear on what they are, but for some reason they made me think of Keir Starmer again. So the two things I really thought about Texas, the two ideas I had was big hair and big hats. Now, I don't think I'm going to get anywhere on the first of those. I'll leave that to some of the people here. But I do very much like the 10-gallon hat. And I think about this. If Kamala had won the last election and you'd had all that inflation, it would be a 2-gallon hat, wouldn't it? And you'd need all of it with $100 bills just to pay the tip to the valet. But I understand that a 10-gallon hat only holds a quarter of a gallon. Is that right? That's like ordering a quarter pounder and getting a calf fry. But there I go talking about Keir Starmer again. Now you might be wondering why an unelected British peer is coming here to hymn the praises of the world's greatest republic on its 250th birthday. Well, I was, as you heard from Dan, I was elected for a while. And in fact, the last election I fought, you have cows in Texas, right? I mean, you definitely do cattle here. Any cattle. The last election, I knocked on the door of a beef farmer in part of Hampshire, and he was very excited to discover that I was his member of the European Parliament. And he told me this great sob story about a seed bull that wouldn't do the business. He'd spent a fortune on this pedigree stud and put it with all of his heifers, and it wouldn't serve any of them. And then online he'd found this terrific potion, and bingo, the bull couldn't get enough of it, and all his heifers were in calf. And now he said the EU was banning the substance, and he was very alarmed about this, and what was I going to do about it? And I said, well, let me look into that for you, sir. What's the name of the thing? He said, well, I can't rightly recall the full chemical name, you understand, but I can tell you that it tastes of aniseed. So I think cattlemen the world over are pretty much of a muchness, really, aren't they? all these anniversaries, we were just hearing about them now. Anne mentioned it was Jefferson's birthday and the assassination of Lincoln. I thought I'm going to have to do better than that and be more local. So I was Googling frantically while our speakers were talking, and it turns out that today is also, how's this for as Texan as they come, it is the anniversary of the 4 in 5 seconds shooting at El Paso. It's kind of self-explanatory, really, what that is for. The 4 in 5 seconds special operation, as Putin would probably call it, when there was this terrific gunfight which resulted in all of those corpses. And I'm guessing the invention of NASCAR, I think that would have been when it began. But the real reason I wanted to come here is because I think Texas is, if you like, America squared. I think it is the most American state in America, perhaps because it had to think about joining, perhaps because, uniquely, it had this separate existence as an independent republic. And I think that concentrated minds. When foreigners think about the image of Americans, they are generally thinking of Texas. When people in Britain or Europe, the first thing that comes into your mind, and by the way, I say Britain and Europe because saying you Europeans is kind of like saying to a Texan, you North Americans. It's true in a technical and geographical sense, but it only really scratches the surface of identity. When we think of the US, we're thinking of those hats and boots, but we're thinking more also of the independence of spirit and the restlessness and the energy that I think is concentrated in the Lone Star State. You know, there's that character in The Simpsons who's just called Rich Texan. That's kind of more or less what people have got in, and we've met a few of them today. And I say that because the thing that we heard it, didn't we, from our previous speakers about Tocqueville, that the peculiar characteristic of this republic is the elevation of the individual above the collective. And as the Texan, accustomed and habituated to independence, as he has learned to be independent of the state, so he wants to be in an independent state. And that, I think, is what has made this country rich and great and free. Isn't it wonderful to learn that Thomas Jefferson carried around a copy of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations? Because what's the essence of Adam Smith's message that Anne was talking about? It's that, and this was utterly counterintuitive and against all of the received wisdom in 1776, it's that leaving things alone works better than trying to plan them. And that is, if you think about it, it flies in the face of common sense. The idea that you leave an economy to arrange itself higgledy-piggledy, and that will lead to more prosperity and more human flourishing than having a wise committee of disinterested patriots making all the decisions in the interests of the collective, that flies in the face of common sense. And yet we all know it to be true. And we've seen it to be true. It's the difference between East Germany and West Germany, the difference between North Korea and South Korea. But this is the place where that creed was turned into a nation, where a dream of liberty was given political form, and the energy of that freedom then carried that nation's flag to the moon, and may now carry it to Mars, because it's part of the American heritage that you carry the loftiest dreams of mankind. It's that dream that brought tens of millions of people from every continent and archipelago to want to settle here. Right? Think about this. Here we are on the border. Ask yourself this. Why is, I mean, we're not on the border here, but Texas being a border state, right? Why is it that the flow of population across the Texan-Mexican border is so overwhelmingly in one direction? Why is that? Why has no Mexican politician ever had to say, I'm going to build a wall and I'm going to get the gringos to pay for it? Why has that problem never arisen? Is it some magical property in your soil? or your water, or your skies, or even your gene pool? I don't think so. I think there's something else going on. Is it maybe the Liberty Bell, which, by the way, was in really good condition when we sent it from London? It didn't have that crack in it. I don't know what you guys did to it. Well, we're getting a little bit closer there, right? We're getting a little bit closer. The Liberty Bell stands for an institutional arrangement that is immanent in your structures, in your forms of governance. Here's the extraordinary thing as we celebrate your 250th birthday as a republic. You have had one constitution. You're still on your first during that period. Look on the other side of the border and see how often people change their constitutional arrangements. I was born in Lima, Peru. I was brought up, tengo ese honor de haber nacido en Lima. I'm qualified already to live in Texas with my linguistic skills. And my native Peru is now on its 12th constitution. And by the way, that makes it pretty conservative by Latin American standards. Venezuela is on its 26th. The Dominican Republic is on its 32nd. There are over 300 constitutions in Latin America as a whole in the time that you have still been on your first. Now, what's the connection between that institutional structure and the one-way movement of population? Well, that constitutional heritage is what ensures that your politicians are servants and not rulers. Because all of them swear an oath to the supremacy of this document. By the way, that I think is another really interesting and underexplored phenomenon of the American experience. The US citizens, you as ordinary Americans don't need to swear allegiance, but the people who represent you put their first allegiance to the Constitution even above their constituents, right? They are there to serve the supreme authority represented in this document, and that has served to prevent the concentration of power. All nations, all unions tend to grow according to the DNA that is encoded at the time of their foundation. You can do a lot worse than to compare the US Constitution here to that of, say, the European Union. The US, being founded in a popular revolt against a remote government, always had its sympathy with the dispersal and decentralization and democratization of power. The EU, born out of the Second World War, was the other way around. It wanted to have power in the hands of a group of wise technocrats who could decide on behalf of everybody else. Result, your constitution, with every amendment, is 7,200 words. The European Constitution, now the Treaty of Lisbon, is 78,000 words. Yours is mainly confined to the big issues like where do you draw the border between state and federal jurisdiction. The EU Constitution busies itself with everything, with the rights of disabled people, the status of asylum seekers, space exploration. Your Declaration of Independence famously promises life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The EU's equivalent, the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, guarantees Europeans' rights to strike action, affordable housing, and free healthcare. By the way, another reason not to name streets after Cesar Chavez, right? I mean, what's this thing of having a street named after a labor? It's like the cars are allowed to stop whenever they feel like it. Come on, you can do better than that as Americans and as Texans. You are not the EU. Frederick Douglass described these documents as the ring pull. They are the thing that centers American life, that ensures that everyone, wherever their grandparents were born, becomes an heir to the same patrimony. You could do a lot worse than to quote what Calvin Coolidge said 100 years ago, almost to the day 100 years ago, when he was celebrating the 150th. Amid the clash of conflicting interest, amid the welter of partisan politics, every American can turn for solace and consolation to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States with the assurance and confidence that those two great charters of freedom and justice remain firm and unshaken. Ultimately, the difference between this side of the border and the other is that here, the rules are above the rulers. Process is above outcome. When you have an election and your guy doesn't win, you accept the outcome. When you have a law that you don't like, you obey it or you get yourself elected to try and change it. When you think that the level of tax is excessive, you don't opt out of it individually. That makes this country highly unusual, not only in this hemisphere, but globally. The US is an outlier in all of those ways. Which leads me to the difficult question. How long do you think you can keep that up? Let me ask the question another way, right? Is the US becoming more Latin American in its politics? Or is Latin America becoming more like the US? Today is the third continuing day of the count of the most recent presidential election in my native Peru. There are already, before we've got the results, mass demonstrations today against the process. People saying it's fraudulent before they even know what it is, because of irregularities in polling. I grew up in Latin America thinking that as places like Peru became richer and more educated, they would become more like the US. That they would become places where everyone took the rules as more than just guidelines, right? That there would be only the one official constitution. I wonder whether there isn't a danger the other way around, of reversion to the mean. We live in a chaotic universe. The US is the extraordinary achievement, and it requires constant curation to keep it that way. When I hear American politicians on both sides demanding that opponents be locked up, when I see losing parties automatically going to law, automatically, to try and overturn election results, when I see people talking as though the Constitution is just a kind of an opinion, it doesn't really stand in the way of having an extra third term or whatever it is, it's all very familiar to me. That's what led to the chaos of my native South America, where regimes would lurch from one revolution to another, one dictatorship to another, because they had stopped elevating process over outcome. And if you think about it, that is the most natural way for people to be. We're a tribal species. We're a species of social primates. We're accustomed to being led, and we're accustomed to thinking tribally. My guys are good, and the other guys are not good. And so when you hold power, and what may be a transient and fleeting public majority wants to give it to people that you think are a danger to your country, the most normal and natural response is to say, well, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to change the rules. We're going to have Constitution number 171 in order to prevent this transfer because we think it's going to be bad. Right? What self-discipline is required? To say no. We're sometimes going to win and we're sometimes going to lose. But everyone is going to be happier if we live under a system where, well, as John Adams put it, a government of laws and not of men. A system where the rules matter more than the flesh and blood candidate. Extraordinary thing. That allegiance to these desiccated parchments has led to this extraordinary 250-year stretch. And yet that's what's done it. And here's the point. Every generation has the responsibility to keep that going. What happened in that wonderful old courthouse in Philadelphia, that extraordinary secular miracle, that was not like a one-off thing that happened forever, and that therefore anyone who sets foot here is automatically habituated to living in an open society. Every generation has to keep teaching the same truths, otherwise they get lost. That's where organizations like TFAS come in. The great German-American philosopher Hannah Arendt, the chronicler of the Eichmann trials, had a nice phrase. She said, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. Right? We all come into this world with the same intellectual and emotional apparatus that we would have done 10,000 years ago. The reason that we don't live like we did 10,000 years ago with a life expectancy of 28 is because we are heirs to an accumulated inheritance greater than any single generation could have built on its own. And we hold that inheritance on a repairing lease. It's our duty to keep improving it and to keep teaching our children out of their barbarism. Keep teaching them these counter-cyclical, counter-intuitive, and difficult truths. The truths on which this republic born in the Enlightenment rests. The idea that someone you don't like might be telling the truth. The idea that the veracity of a statement is intrinsic and is not determined by who is saying it. The idea that you can reach the truth through a process of experimentation, trial and error, logic and argument. The idea that you apply the scientific method. None of these things come naturally to our primate brains. All of them have to be taught. And their political expression is the elevation of the rule of law over one party. Every generation has that responsibility, and I think that was in the minds of the founders and indeed in the minds of the architects of this room. Right? Look at all the classical quotations around us from Lucan and Livy and Cicero and Sallust. Right? This was the intellectual hinterland of the people who drew up the Declaration and then drew up the Constitution. They had seen, because they'd learnt it from early childhood in their histories, they'd seen what happens when republics fall. They'd seen how frail and fragile it is to keep alive a system where sometimes the other guys win and you're expected to put up with it. The centerpiece of this room that I'm looking at is the assassination of Caesar on the far wall there. The reason that all those people in the Federalist Papers and anti-Federalist papers were writing as Brutus and Cato and so on is because they were obsessed with the idea of the difficulty of keeping alive Republican virtue in an age when people see the attraction of immediate, short-term power. There was a moment when the Roman Republic might have been restored, just after the assassination of Caligula. It wasn't clear who was going to be emperor. There was a vacuum, and the Senate could have reasserted its prerogatives. The historian Josephus records one of the senators making a very moving speech where he says it would be enough to live 1 hour under the laws of our fathers. 1 hour under the laws that raised our republic to greatness, but it didn't last. As soon as the word got out that a new Caesar had been chosen, they were all rushing to throw themselves at the feet of the new dictator because they wanted some short-term advantage over the common weal, over the benefit of the republic. Now, look at your politicians today and ask yourself, are they so very different? And if they're not, whose fault is that? The old chestnut has it, democracies get the leaders they deserve, unless there is pressure from everybody to keep intact these peculiarities of the republic, then you will get the politicians you deserve. So let me close. I started in Dallas, and I'm going to finish in Dallas with the words of Hatton Sumner's, a congressman for this city from 1913 to 1947. A speech he made in 1937, he said, "We have no king. We, the people, are our own masters. If we fail, constitutional government fails." That's the responsibility that all of you have. You are lucky enough to be heirs to this extraordinary tradition, and that carries with it a commensurate responsibility to pass on to the next generation the liberties that you were lucky enough to inherit from your parents, and to ensure that they're still there in future. So let me close with a heartfelt imprecation from a British conservative who loves his country very much to Americans who still believe in theirs. Honor the vision of your founders. Never forget what people you are and what responsibility that brings. And never be afraid to speak to and for the soul of this great nation, of which by good fortune and God's grace, you are privileged to be part. I think we have a little bit of time if people would like to ask questions. Maybe Roger or maybe Lindsay will make throat-slitting gestures at me if I'm going on for too long. So please, anybody, if anybody would like to comment, or no, not necessarily on what I've been talking about. If you want to ask me about Brexit or what's happening in Britain or whatever, that's cool as well.
Hi. What do you think the election they just had in Hungary is going to, what effect it will have over the course of the EU and its unity or disunity?
It's a very good question. So Viktor Orban, who had been in government for a long time, lost pretty comprehensively to a candidate of the right. It's quite important to stress this, right? A lot of the spin that we were getting from the Fidesz people and from their allies, the sort of NatCon-tinted allies here, was, Magyar himself may have been a conservative, but all these kind of Soros globalists attached themselves to his coalition. If they did, you don't see it in his manifesto, right? This is a low-tax, patriotic, anti-immigrant. In fact, he's more tough on immigration than Orban was. It's true that he is not discourteous about the EU, but Orban never actually did anything about trying to leave the EU. You know, he attacked it verbally, but then he went along with it. So I think it's good to see Hungarian democracy working. I think it's good that people had enough of illiberalism and corruption and a one-party autocracy that was intolerant of opposition. And I can't help noticing that there has been an almost hysterical reaction from some American conservatives, again, on the kind of outright integralist wing of things, as though this represents the end of civilization. I wonder whether what's bothering them is precisely the idea that such a government that had been in office for a long time and was self-serving and illiberal, might be replaced by the right, might be replaced by a recognizable kind of Reaganite conservative. That perhaps would explain why there is such a hysterical tone about really quite a small country, quite a long way away from here. If Hungarians can do this, if Hungarians can bring the balance back, so can you. Yes, sir.
Do you think that Britain is on a irreversible path to more and more socialism?
Nothing is irreversible, right? I mean, that's what they used to say about the EU. It's what they used to say about communism. Nothing is irreversible, but things are bad. People like voting for free stuff. And until the money runs out, they will carry on doing that. Particularly since the lockdown, people have been convinced that there really is some kind of magic money tree. They don't like to make connections and trade-offs. They don't like to face the fact that paying themselves to sit in their gardens for the better part of 2 years without working was, if you like, borrowing from their future selves, and that there is now a payback in terms of higher prices as well as higher taxes. But I would say this. We could have had exactly this conversation in the mid to late 70s in Britain. It felt every bit as bleak. People thought the country was over, gone to the dogs, irreversible decline. We didn't know it, but we were on the cusp of a national revival. And what made that happen was people clocking that there was nothing left. We had a bailout from the International Monetary Fund in 1976, and it shattered people's illusions. We realized that we couldn't carry on spending and taxing and borrowing without a cost. And so the question is, are we still the people we were? Can we have another Thatcher revival of the kind that we did after 1979. I'd be reluctant to give up on my country at this point in life. We have a very bad habit in Britain of leaving things until almost too late. But up until now, we've always caught on just before the disaster. Sir, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, there's two more. Sorry, one, two. I do apologize, sorry.
So you were able to hold this up.
Yes.
The United States has a capital C constitution. United Kingdom, Great Britain has a small c constitution. And for a long time, the rights of Englishmen didn't seem to be terribly different than the rights of Americans in lots of fundamental ways. But I think in the area of free speech, we have this very unambiguous language, Congress shall make no law.
Yeah.
But you don't have that very unambiguous language. You just have this historical tradition. And we're seeing, well, could you offer some reflections on, first of all, the importance of written constitutions versus not written, but also the context of free speech?
So you're absolutely right. I mean, I think we can say it now, after 250 years. Actually, a lot of the American Revolution was based on a QAnon-level weird conspiracy theory that the monarchy was about to establish some kind of medieval autocracy. Right? Plainly, that did not happen. Right? And indeed, in the United Kingdom, there was a continuing movement towards greater democracy and greater freedom, just as there was here, unsurprisingly, since they were a single polity coming with the same bias and disposition, as Burke put it in his speech on conciliating the Americas. So, for a long time, the two polities then evolved in parallel. And there was an awful lot of toing and froing and so on. I was seeing just now a tweet from an American visitor in London saying, God, how extraordinary that there's a statue of George Washington in Trafalgar Square. It's not at all. I mean, there was immense support for George Washington at the time. Americans are always surprised by how much political and parliamentary support there was for the Patriot cause in London in the 1770s. But you're absolutely right that there has been this divergence recently. And again, the US is the outlier. The US has diverged not just from the United Kingdom, but from Canada, Australia, and everywhere else that doesn't have this constitutional guarantee. You're incredibly lucky to have it. I've often thought, Andrew sitting next to you heard me say this last week, I've often thought it's bizarre that the Bill of Rights existed in a way, right? Because think about it, you've got this constitution that says, here's what the government is allowed to do, and anything not mentioned here, they're not allowed to do, right? That seems pretty clear. And then Madison comes along and says, yeah, but here are some things that they're really, really, really not allowed to do. Right? I mean, it is logically quite an odd thing. And honestly, I think the Bill of Rights was put there simply because England had the same Bill of Rights in 1689, and they thought it was kind of a nice thing to have. Well, all sorts of accidental things have the happiest of consequences, and this is one of them. Without that amendment, there would almost certainly have been the same pressure as in the rest of the Anglosphere for diminutions of free speech in the name of defending the sensibilities of selected groups, which is really what it all came down to. And that was a pathology that began here. Right? I mean, we all picked it, the rest of the Anglosphere all picked it up from you. But we didn't have the defense of the First Amendment. At the height of the BLM madness in 2020, every other Anglosphere country adopted their own version of it because they were basically shoehorning an American argument into their own very different circumstances, however unpromising, however unpropitious. In Canada, it took the form of this invention of a genocide in the boarding schools for the Indigenous kids, and now been shown to be total nonsense, but the refutation got 1% of the coverage of the original charge. In Australia, it took the form of what they called the Indigenous voice to Parliament, trying to change the constitutional principle that every citizen was equal before the law. In New Zealand, it took the form of reopening the Treaty of Waitangi. And in the United Kingdom, we all just pretended that we were Mississippians. Right? We just adopted, without alteration, the language and the iconography of the arguments of desegregation, which had zero relevance to us, and which culminated in the almost funny scene of a white British BLM crowd in Whitehall, outside Downing Street, shouting, "Hands up, don't shoot," at unarmed Metropolitan Police. And this is the weird way in which our entire polity has become America-brained, at least on these issues of ethnicity, you know? If you're a black conservative, they call you an Uncle Tom. If you're a white conservative, they call you a Klansman. I mean, other than being unbelievably rude, what's that got to do with us? Right? Selma and segregation was not our story, and yet people are so marinated in sort of watching all these episodes of West Wing and so on that they genuinely think that it's become our story. So this is all a long and roundabout way of saying this was your problem, but we didn't have the defense of the First Amendment. But I hope that just as the virus came from here and infected the rest of the English-speaking world, now that you seem to have come out with the antibodies, I hope that that also will spread to the rest of the Anglosphere. Okay, as we got time for just one more here, this is very quick question, quick answer.
I'll make it quick. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on the degradation of freedom in a place like Hong Kong and the British government's response or lack thereof.
Yeah, I got China so wrong. I thought that China was moving, China was moving towards relative economic and political freedom, but I had not spotted, and I don't think anyone else has, how suddenly things changed when Xi Jinping took over in 2012, how quickly both the economic and the political reforms were reversed. Again, you know, what happened in Hong Kong was extraordinary for the same reason that what happened here was extraordinary. That it was this very unusual place where property rights were secure, contracts were taken seriously, and every other freedom came from that. And it was the work actually of one ingenious chief financial secretary in Hong Kong called Cowperthwaite, who ran the place in the 60s and 70s. With all the left-wing British colonial officials, there was bound to be one exception. It just happened to be him. Towards the end of his life, he very rarely did this. He very rarely lectured, but I did meet him once. And I said, what was the secret? What did you do in Hong Kong that nobody else was doing in the 60s? How did you make this miracle with the low taxes and the low regulations? You know what he said? He said, if you're the government, doing nothing is a full-time job. I had to be at my office before the first of my officials arrived, and I had to be there after the last of them had gone home, or they would have started regulating things. It's what they do. So to keep a free economy, you have to be always pruning the undergrowth. It's the same lesson as here. Don't think that it's happened once and that lets the rest of us off the hook. Every one of us is engaged in a lifelong commitment to keep freedom alive.
I recall when we announced that Daniel Hannan was going to be our America 250 visiting fellow. Supporter sent me a text message saying, Roger, are you tone deaf? You've got someone from Great Britain as your America 250 fellow? And I said, just wait till you hear him. And I think this is a reflection of a good decision that I made. Lord Hannan is traveling the country for us. Tomorrow we'll be in Houston, and he's been in several places earlier this year, and we'll continue throughout the year, spreading the message not only with Lord Hannan, but with others like Ryan Streeter and Ann Bradley to talk about the importance of limited government and economic freedom. I just would close by saying that Thomas Jefferson, since it's his birthday, had said, the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. Well, at TFAS, we remember that, and we say, not on our watch. We aren't going to let that happen. And we're going to solve that problem by reaching the next generation of leaders. So thank you to all of you who support us, those of you who helped sponsor this event. I will just mention one person who's here, since he's a member of our Board of Regents, Brian Hale, who's hosted events at his house with his wife Stacy here today. Thank you. Dan Branch introduced our other trustees who are here. My last thing is the elevator speech I give people about what we do is that we identify and recruit young people with outstanding potential. We educate them and offer them a transformative experience in our programs, and then we send them forth to change the world. And it's that simple. So thank you for your support. Please grab this brochure before you leave. Take it with you. We'd welcome support from any of you who aren't supporters now. The reception will begin upstairs in just a few minutes, as soon as we can get up there. Thank you.